I run Cybersalon. I'm chair of Cybersalon, and I will look after everybody today. So I'm going to make the discussion going. But a couple of words about Cybersalon. So we've been founded in 1997, mainly to lead on digital activism and keep the growing digital monopolies in check. We also co-drafted Digital Bill of Rights, and our claim to fame is that we managed to get it as far as Labour Party manifesto with my esteemed colleague Richard Barbrook, who is on the chat and will join us later. And we're working on the new digital democracy draft for Labour Party, so watch this space. But for other activities, we've done quite a few games. We have an offshoot called Digital Liberties, and we wrote a game with Google, which was about inclusion and empathy. A little mobile game on WhatsApp, but it was quite successful. So we started exploring the inclusive digitality as probably quite potential for us. It's something that we just raise some funds and we'll do more of. But we also do digital training. So our main income comes from digital training, and we're working with EU on replacing a computer driving license, which has been in place for over 20 years now, and it's really not fit for purpose. So we wrote a new European qualifications called DigiBlocks. So hopefully that will help people who are migrating to digital and help to bridge digital divide, which in Europe is still quite significant. I think in States even bigger. So that's about us. So tonight's event is sponsored by Hydro 66, which has sponsored us for a while now. And it's a fully green, water-powered data center, which is trying to compete on provision of green energy with Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services. So not an easy job, but they're all coal-based. And every time you drop a cat on your Facebook, it generally is powered by coal. So we're trying to shift and raise awareness that actually those things can be done on water-powered data centers. So that's about us. So in terms of the plan tonight, so I would like to invite each of the speakers to say a little bit about what they're going to talk to us about. So a couple of minutes each, and then we go to the main bit. So can we start from David?
Sure. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me here. Seems like such a great event. So my name is David Bering-Porter. I'm a professor of culture and media at the New School in New York City. My research is on sort of digital media and race and labor and technology. And so this is obviously a really excellent event for me. You know, basically what I want to talk about today is kind of thinking about not just sort of the relationship between race and technology, but rather race as a technology and how we can start to think about that in conjunction with Afrofuturism, right, as a kind of really fascinating digital discourse. So that's a short preview.
Right. And as an aside, David is teaching in the New School where my daughter has been taking his classes. So he can highly recommend it.
Yes.
Okay, could we have Paul, please, Paul?
Sure. First and foremost, can everybody hear me okay? I'm wearing headphones, so just making sure we're okay, cool.
Yeah, perfect. Very good.
Greetings, everybody, and especially Doug. It's great to see you again, and David and Derek. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Okay, so I'm a writer, artist, and musician, and I'm very interested in some of what I'm calling sort of the dialectic of enlightenment that one could argue capitalism has kind of shifted us into thinking about the ashes of the Enlightenment. If you look at the rearview mirror, the reason I'm saying the Enlightenment is because this notion of the notion of the age of reason, the age of being able to have scientific inquiry, many of those things have been radically destabilized by digital narratives. So I'm a writer, artist, musician, three things. My DJ name is DJ Spooky. I've been DJing globally for the last 20 years. I published books with MIT, usually about art and technology. And I was one of the original moderators of the Afrofuturism list, served in the ancient 90s. So I've been involved with this for a long time. Then let's see, from an arts perspective, I'm here in Colorado, and actually you guys probably can't see it, but there's huge plumes of smoke over me as the forests are burning. And ash is actually falling on my, I don't know, you guys probably can't see it, but I thought it'd be a nice dramatic intervention to have ash raining down during the discussion. So yeah, I'm a climate activist as well. I've been dealing with quite a few events and situations to raise awareness about the connectivity between climate change, the radical interventions of what it means to be human in this era of algorithmic and computational propaganda, bots. We can call Trump, for example, the president as malware, so these are things I'm just kind of riffing on for the moment. And I'm hoping to kind of be someone who's a provocateur during the discussion. So thanks everybody for joining.
We like the concept of provocateur. I remember listening to your launch of imaginary apps in London, in ThoughtWorks, I think, and how captivated we were by the book. So hopefully we can talk about it later. Okay, Douglas, a couple of words of what you're going to talk about today.
Sure, I want to be one of the provocateurs too. We'll all be provocateur. We'll all be countercultural to whatever the main thing is. Yeah, my couple of words. I'm Douglas Rushkoff. I've been writing about media technology and society since really the late '80s, and experienced great excitement and subsequent disillusionment as the kind of psychedelic, open-minded possibilities of a connected society were replaced by a more of a Wired magazine vision of extraction and control. And I'm finding some new hope, not necessarily in COVID, but in the way that cybernetics, really, the way that these digital media forces feedback loops and forces a circularity on our very digital culture. So I don't look at it as coincidence that we're retrieving the commons and medievalism and Blackness and humanity, really all at the same time, that they seem to be, we're revisiting things. Things are being, dredged is really the wrong word, but we're being revisited really by a lot of things that we thought to repress really since the last Renaissance, since the Enlightenment, since the Age of Reason, since Francis Bacon said that empirical science would allow us to grab nature by the forelock, hold her down, and submit her to our will. I think now we're all, even the white tech bros, are getting submitted to the will of science and technology. And so there's a wider cultural awakening to the fact that we have become we've become, not the software, even not the technology, but the medium. We are now the objects being programmed rather than the people programming other things. So I think it's a terrific moment for people to realize just what humanity might have to do if we want to restore agency and autonomy in this moment.
Right. Yes. Trump as malware. I can subscribe to that. Okay. And if we can have a couple of minutes, Derek, if you can introduce yourself.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Good evening. And again, thank you for coming because like probably most of you, I've just left one Zoom call after leaving another Zoom call after leaving another Zoom call to come onto yet another Zoom call. So I'm hoping you can stay with, because I'm largely going to be here staying with everyone else. I kind of entered into this area pretty much about the same time as everybody else has, particularly Paul and others, back in the early to mid 90s. I came into the area of working with digital creative technologies from a route that took me from cultural democracy, what we then called community arts, and now kind of shunned for a preferable term, which is participatory arts practice. And I think that's important to understand, because prior to kind of nosediving into these areas of practice, my work was focused primarily on the cultural democracy agenda, on the idea of participation, on the idea of everyone having agency to create. And it was embraced, therefore, at that time as with all kinds of revolutionary ambition around plurality, around, you know, access to the controls, around breaking down the hegemony around these areas of practice. Now we live in an area where we have 4 monopolies that largely control things, where we're sold the idea of ease of use in order to then take away our agency, and it very much looks like old. It very looks like old monodirectional media, very much. But in perhaps, if you gauge the temperature, you gauge the mood, you listen to the way people talk at the moment, perhaps in an even more pernicious way. But I agreed to come on tonight primarily. So that goes. So during that period, I was involved in founding things like Artec, which was the first real area that people learned how to use this technology, and we worked with underrepresented young people from disadvantaged backgrounds as really the first cohort of practitioners in digital in the UK. We founded that organization in 1991. I went on to co-found and work with a number of people, including Keith Piper, Gary Stewart, and various others, and Mark Booth, forming Digital Diaspora, which is, and some of the activities we organized then, Paul was involved in. And that was the agenda, and that was the excitement around that time. I joined tonight in the middle of a busy schedule, mainly because I was interested in having a discussion with these people here at this particular moment where as everyone else has described, we're seeing a kind of crumbling, accelerated, I think, by the present crisis of that fortress that those monopolies have built. And at the same time, that's been mirrored in very interesting creative activities, which seem to reflect some of the pioneering spirit of that period of the 90s, supercharged with a political agenda that's surrounding us at the moment. I won't be speaking on anything in particular. I'll simply be kind of listening after talking for far too long now, and maybe responding to what Douglas, David, and Paul have to say.
So we've got a lot of provocateurs. Great. That's going to shape up as a great evening. So on without further ado, I think we will go to the main section. So Afrofuturism is something that we obviously been following right from the beginning. Mark Derry definitions and brothers Eshon, but in a way it sort of faded away slightly over the last few years because everybody got excited about different things. So we thought it would be great to look at the history of Black futures. And obviously, as Jaron Lanier said, who controls the future controls the presence. So we wanted to see how the artists and celebrate the artists who are exploring and were exploring the early futurism from the lenses of their own community perspective. So I think, David, if you can take it from there and tell us a bit more, explain the concepts and tell us all about it.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, what I want to talk today about is to get into the idea of Afrofuturism, but again, through the lens of thinking about not just race and technology, which is one of the central themes of something like Afrofuturism, but to think about race as a technology. And here I'm picking up on lines of thinking across literature, media, and philosophy to consider how race itself works as a kind of technology, an instrumentalization of bodies and identities that can be used to extend and often to hinder, right, our capacities and affordances as both an individual and as a culture. So Beth Coleman has argued that race works as one technology among others that allow for the smoother functioning of society. And of course, here I would want to say that smoother functioning doesn't always mean for the betterment of everyone involved. Right. So smoother can actually mean that it just functions to maintain the status quo as easily as possible. So race is a cultural technology that works to divide and organize bodies according to logics of power and control. Of course, if we look historically, race as a technology has been used in incredibly violent ways against certain bodies and of course to the benefit of others. Typically, this consideration of race as technology could be aligned with a school of thought described as Afro-pessimism, but I would also argue that considering race as a kind of technology opens up new horizons that could be more easily aligned with something like Afrofuturism instead. So Afrofuturism, of course, is a term coined by Mark Derry in the 1990s in an interview published with Samuel Delaney, Greg Tate, and Trisha Rose, called Black to the Future, and which entered into dialogue about Black sci-fi writers and culture. And the title of this inaugural essay is actually really key, I think, to understanding the power and purpose of Afrofuturism. It ties nicely also into the thematic of this event, right? Reclaiming cyberspace. And this notion of Black to the Future points to the orientation of this movement toward a future, not toward the past. It's a process of racial technology of reclaiming a future for those living under the sign of Blackness across the diaspora. Kodo Eshun, one of the most brilliant writers on Afrofuturism, notes that those abducted into slavery were in some ways the first true moderns. They often experienced the kind of experience of alienation, existential homelessness, dislocation, dehumanization, and I would argue, commodification, that would later come to be identified with kind of the modern experience and the modern individual. Eshun points out, and I want to quote here, in the colonial era of the early to middle 20th century, avant-gardists from Walter Benjamin to Frantz Fanon revolted in the name of the future against a power structured that relied on control and representation of a historical archive. Today, the situation is precisely reversed. The powerful employ futurists and draw on the power of the futures they endorse, thereby condemning the disempowered to live in the past. End quote. So Eshun will later come to describe this as a kind of sci-fi capitalism, drawing on the work of Mark Fisher, but we can recognize it in our everyday experience and the predictive algorithms that have come about alongside big data, machine learning, and control societies. We can recognize it in the pleasure we take in turning ourselves into data in 100 different ways through social media and body tracking, things like counting steps, breath, heart rate, activities, and of course, in the most recent instances, even like body heat, which is especially interesting around the current pandemic, which of course the fever is a sort of sign of illness, right? So this is the newest sort of Fitbit. So Eshun's insight about the temporal orientations of power seem especially applicable in the digital age, in which the digital divide of those who have access is often oriented across racial lines, although of course that is a complicated area since we see a lot of times technologies get sort of skipped, right? We end up with sort of cellular technologies sort of being in the quote unquote third world at a much higher rate in some ways. So Afrofuturism at its best is a way of reimagining and reclaiming a future to different ends and of rethinking futurism from the margins rather than from those who speak at the center of cultural hegemony. To imagine our bodies and ourselves in a different place, in a different relation to the world, is technology in the hands of those who were themselves viewed as tools and instruments of an exploitative system. And to see our relation to technology as symbiosis, sensor, and affinity rather than only through the lens of use. So we can see this as through one of the founding figures of the genre, through like something like Sun Ra in his 1974 film Space is the Place, which imagines an alternate future through an alternate past. Space in this case is a safer place away from the structural violence of white supremacy, in which something like the music of the spheres is transformed into a kind of transformational technological fantasy. Sun Ra's orchestra, a portmanteau bringing together notions of an arc, right, transporting Black folks away from the dangers of white supremacy. And the orchestra is a means of sort of his dream of liberation. And it's an amazing film. I would certainly encourage people to sort of look at it, but we can also see this in more recent instances of Afrofuturism through kind of pop culture, especially I think the most recent HBO series Lovecraft Country has a couple of episodes that are really strongly framed as something like Afrofuturist technologies. So I think that, you know, one of the things that I just want to say, and I know I'm running short on time here at this point for my 5 minutes, but I think that, you know, Afrofuturism is a really fascinating way of thinking about the use of fantasy as a part of our kind of cultural heritage, right? We can think about using fantasy for productive means, right? It's not simply an escape, but it's a way of really thinking about what we can do with race, technology, fantasy together, right? So Afrofuturism, I think, is really useful for that. And going back to the origins, right? Looking at something like Sun Ra and Space is the Place is a fantastic way of doing that. I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more about any of these things as we go into conversation.
We have the clip that you suggested. So Ben, do you want to pull it up if we just quickly can show?
Yeah, so this is the very beginning of Space is the Place from 1974, the opening credits, featuring Sun Ra himself, of course.
But I don't think we have the sound for that. He's basically saying that they've arrived at a new planet which has much better vibes.
Yeah, so it's a world, right, for Black people, right, away from, so they can sort of see what they can do outside of sort of white supremacy, right? And he's describing this. And we get a vision of this world at the very beginning of the film, which of course mostly takes place in Oakland in the 1970s. But here he's sort of speaking about a very different kind of orientation and sort of location for this.
Yeah, so he's kind of like a messianic figure in that movie where he's thinking about leading the troops to a better vibe place. Yeah, but we don't have the sound, but I think we come back to it.
Yeah.
But you can see the imagery is
Well, yeah, the kind of amazing kind of combination of sort of the spacefaring kind of futurist version with a clearly, you know, Egyptian-oriented kind of aesthetic, right? So we have, again, future and past all taking place kind of simultaneously in this.
yeah, and we won't play the Lovecraft Country, but it's definitely worth watching. It's doing very well at the moment. I think we come back to those. Right, so Paul, do you want to talk about, sorry, we got the Lovecraft.
So this is one scene from Lovecraft Country, which again sort of thinks about time travel, right? And alternate dimensions now in sort of the hands of the margins, right? As opposed to the sort of center, right? So it's actually a really amazing character. This particular character from Lovecraft Country goes through this really transformative experience. And, you know, I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it's a fascinating kind of, again, combination of fantasy, race, and technology. Someone she encounters in the future.
Amazing costumes.
Yeah.
Great. I think we will combine questions after. So if we can move to Paul.
Great.
Okay. First and foremost, yeah, it's funny. With David's presentation, David, thank you for that. One of the things that strikes me, and again, I'm going to provocateur mode here, is Black people, we do not have a monopoly on suffering. And the idea, I disagree with Kojo a lot about some of these issues where every ethnic group has had slavery, every ethnic group has had oppression, every ethnic group has had systematic kind of differentiation that deals with caste, that deals with differentiation based on skin tone. Whether you were a serf in Russia, they were experiencing horrible oppression, or if you were a Jew who was experiencing pogroms. So sometimes my major critique of Afrofuturism is that the notion of this monopoly of suffering that seems to trigger how people respond to this notion of the hidden past conditioning this unknown and untangible future. So what I want to do, by way of sort of adding a slight caveat to what David was saying, is what makes the African-American experience more specifically unique is the diaspora aspect. Most of these other groups are locked in a caste system, whether you're in India, for example, you know, thousands of years of oppression, far longer than anything African-Americans have experienced. And it's still ongoing. There's an incredible book called Caste that just came out a little while ago, where an African-American woman goes to India to see the racial, you know, the untouchables and other kinds of skin coding that occur, light skin, dark skin, Brahmins, and so on. Americans tend to lose track of the fact that the complexity of other societies has long had these kinds of oppressive systems in place. But the hyper-fueled experience of the collision of capitalism, agrarian, rural, Southern culture, and then the sort of the smashing collision of the Civil War and transforming African-American experience and Reconstruction after that, that leads you to all these different trajectories that I think make the African-American experience a little more unique. So that, I'm just putting that out there. Kojo, I disagree with on most of his stuff. So love Kojo, but all right. So with that being said, all right. So can we call up a couple of the images that I sent to Ben? Ben, if you can call up the image of the Acropolis, there's, if you can't, then I'll speak while he's doing that. From my perspective right now, Oh, okay. Well, we can start with that. If you want to pinch out, or okay, we can start with this one. All right, this is me at the Acropolis. I had a concert there a little while ago, and we projected clips of Birth of a Nation throughout the ruins of the Acropolis. And when I was in negotiations with the Greek government, they were like, "But why do you want to project a KKK film at the Acropolis?" So I was like, "You guys are Greek, you know, you got comedy, tragedy," and they're like, "Ah, I get it. Okay, got it." So I chuckle about this notion of the radical impermanence of DJ culture and the radical impermanence of this notion of fixed format architecture that the Acropolis represents. The seeking of permanence in Western culture, this sort of this deep obsession throughout the history of the West of aspiring to permanence, whether it be Hitler's notion of a 1,000-year Reich, or for that matter, the legacy of the Western notions of the ideal, the notion of city on the hill, you know, and Thomas Aquinas, and this obsession with linear time. DJ culture dismantles that and makes a nonlinear kind of collage-based approach to the logic of capitalism. Now, the reason I'm saying DJ culture is it's not just specifically about music, it's about the logic of collage. And African-American culture is a living, breathing collage of all these cultures that have left the legacy and the trace of these different issues that David so eloquently pointed out. To me, at least, can you go to the next slide at the Acropolis? Oh, well, that's a different kind of Acropolis. All right. So this is where we had the concert. And so I walk out on stage and we had about 5,000 people at the show and say, "Hey, everyone, thanks for coming out." Those are huge sound systems. And if you kind of zoom in, this is where a lot of early Greek theater kind of had its basic implications. It's called the Herodotus Theater, and the architecture of it represented this kind of, you know, people would be wearing masks, they would be having this sort of engagement with sound because the architecture of the space amplified the sound. And you didn't need to actually shout. And of course, even putting a sound system in the ruins of the Acropolis is itself a statement about collage. So we had about 5,000 people come out and say, "Hey, everyone, thanks for coming to the show. You know, you're standing there, you know, in the middle of making this remix of a crazy KKK film called Rebirth of a Nation and projecting it with electronic music and sound throughout the ruins." So we can go to the next slide. Either the one of, okay, yeah. So a little hip hop moment here. Was this, whoa, okay. Just, yeah, so the sense of humor here is that as an African-American, the notion of, there's a very famous series of essays that were called Black Athena that came out a couple years ago that kind of described the legacy of ancient Greece and its relationship to African-American culture from the viewpoint of how African-Americans had generated a series of both improvisational engagements with the West and looking at ancient Greek history's appropriation of Africa. One could argue whether it was Heraclitus or whether it was Pythagoras. The ancient Greeks had engaged with Egyptian culture from the viewpoint, again, of diaspora. They were scholars and people going to North Africa to study and so on. So we can go to the next slide. It's the one of the gentleman being stabbed by the American flag. And this slide that you're going to see is called "The Soiling of Old Glory." And this is a very famous riot incident. And it's a really renowned photographer's work. He won the Pulitzer Prize. And here we are in an era where the president of the United States is kind of a super spreader in chief. We're not just in a biological pandemic, but we're in an information pandemic. And to me, at least, Afrofuturism is essentially a set of thought tools. It's tools to dismantle the sort of hierarchical engagements that people have had with this notion of the American sense of idealism and that kind of clash and collage-based aesthetic that we all can kind of engage in when you think about the crisis of democracy that we're in right now. So I'm using this image as kind of a statement for the summer of 2020. And really not too much has changed. And when you think about Black Lives Matter and you think about the crisis of democracy, we have an election about 14 days from now. And it's, one could argue, the most important election probably in human history, mainly from the basis of climate change. So for me, at least, Afrofuturism, when I was engaged with it in the late 90s to early 2000s, was to kind of say that we need better thought tools. And the tools of capitalism, the tools of social media, the tools of all of these issues that linger around the digital discourse had been used to create what I call a sort of a colonization of the subconscious. The African-American sense of resistance to that colonization became a foundational aspect of America, but the legacy of white grievance is really fascinating, because right now that's what has allowed Trump and people like Boris Johnson and the UK and so on, is to leverage this notion of being part of a sense of whites that have been aggrieved, whether it be Brexit, whether it be this notion of the QAnon. All of those are conditioned and kind of contextualized by algorithmic propaganda. So one could argue African-American song, African-American dance is a different kind of physical embodiment of algorithmic narrative. And to me, at least, these are issues that linger over the conversation as we move further into 2021 and beyond. So the future is a very famous adage from Orwell. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. But that sense of totalitarian narrative, actually, one could argue America has had as a foundational aspect of the crisis of sort of representative democracy. And that crisis goes to even what it means to be a human. If you can go to the next slide that says, I'm a man. So this is another famous photograph this is from 1968. It was a sanitation worker strike. And this notion of the definition of human being was first broached in the one of the most famous documents of the Enlightenment, the American Constitution. So nowhere in the Constitution does it say America is a democracy, but human beings were created for production use. And that's a certain part of the way that African Americans were defined as being 2/3 of a human being for tax purposes. And what ended up happening is after the Civil War, we needed to kind of re-update the definition of human, because the collision between the rural agrarian Southern production methods and the Northern industrial capitalist methods didn't work. And the context of the war allowed the North to colonize the South. To me, at least, what's fascinating right now is we're seeing a hyper-corporate kind of reconstruction of the definition of humanity, or being a human being, by social media. And I'm intrigued with that collision of the 1968 riots, the reclaiming of what it means to be human. All of those issues linger as a kind of a series of nonlinear uncertainties at the heart of the American project. To me, at least right now, we're seeing art, science, and technology being questioned to their absolute foundations by stuff like QAnon, stuff like the president. And these are things where African-American culture actually is, I think, a good conduit back to some of the best aspects of the Enlightenment. This notion of what they would say, liberté, fraternité, and so on. So with that said and done, if we can leave the slides and just go back to normal camera. I don't want to go on longer than that, but I do feel like the implicit critique of capitalism that we're dealing with right now, as we think about the top multi-billion-dollar corporations, whether it be Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and so on, they all depend on this algorithmic sort of colonization of the subconscious, which was actually part of the basic premise of moving beyond physical goods. We're in an attention-based economy, and that still has a very strange legacy left with African-American culture, the sort of the demand for being the cry of humanity from the heart of things. So these are kind of ideas that I just wanted to put out there. So whether it be Birth of a Nation as this defining moment of Hollywood, and the rise of blackface, it was mostly white people in blackface. These are all things that, to me, at least, leave a legacy of the questioning of identity itself. Online, you're going to be seeing mostly, say, for example, Trump's Twitter bots, they're pretending to be Black people. I'm sure you might have seen or heard about that. But they're actually then created by Russian hackers in St. Petersburg. There's a specific information warfare unit that they also tried to hack the last election. So these are all things that go back to that sort of crisis of democracy that I just wanted to kind of say the Civil War acted as a sort of a pivot point. So I'll leave it for the rest of everyone, but I did want to just say that part of these issues that I'm dealing with is a collage aspect about how we think of the human initiative in an era of ubiquitous information. So hopefully that wasn't too much, but it was collage. So there we go.
That was a great collage. Thank you very much, Paul. Very interesting. In some way, it just makes me think that, with all the investigations of the future, we were coming from the generation of very positive expectations that the future will always be better. But so far, it hasn't quite turned up to be as good as we expected. So the future is not what it used to be. as Richard Barbrook is prone to say. He was actually making a comment in chat that US political system is definitely set up to minimize democracy, not to maximize. So I think there's a bigger conversation there. But following
Wait,
up,
hey, Eva, before, just a tiny intervention there. I would like to remix that phrase and just say the future isn't what it used to be. And that's where the pun here of how we look at expectation management in the era where African-American culture has become a kind of a foundation of the global subconscious, whether it be in electronic music, hip hop, techno, dubstep, all of that comes out of the African-American vernacular, or the displacement of identity that blackface sort of represented as the foundation of American theater and then going on to film, all of which is a pun here for a displaced identity. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there.
Yes, so building on that, I know that Douglas has spent a lot of time thinking about the future and why it isn't what it was meant to be, and what lenses we can apply to find a better path to the next bit of the future, because there's always the next bit. That's coming quite fast, because we've been working on the cutting edge of technology, most of us, for more than 20 years. And there's lots of good stuff, but there's also really hair-raising stuff. The good stuff, probably Wikipedia. The bad stuff, we all know. But I'm interested in Douglas' position, because you spent a lot of time talking to people like Bering-Porter and Aguilera, and looking at the different alternative perspectives on the future and what we can learn from that, and should we be revisiting those views a bit more aggressively?
Yeah, yeah, I can talk about that, and also as it relates to this idea of race as a technology and Afrofuturism as retrieval. I feel like in some ways, one of the crucial mistakes we made in the late 80s and early 90s as digital technology was emerging is we were still members of a television media environment. And I feel like our visions of a digital future were informed more by our television mentality than a digital one, which we couldn't have yet because we were still migrating to the digital realm. And what I mean by that is television has a bias towards globalism, towards one big blue marble, the simultaneity of broadcast, watching the Olympics or the moon landing. Television is the medium that allows, Ronald Reagan to stand in front of the Brandenburg Gate and say, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." That's TV, this sort of one embracing thing. And it ends up, on the positive side in some ways with a kind of, Oprah Winfrey, hands around the world, kumbaya like global celebration mentality, that boomer hippie thing, and CNN and Global Witness and all that. But on the negative side, of course, it brings, the World Trade Organization, WTO protests, and global capitalism, and everything happening at industrial scale. But for me, as a white psychedelic techno enthusiast of the early 1990s, as I understood Blackness online, it seemed to be that this would allow for the dream of the kind of the Marlo Thomas free to be you and me race blindness to take hold, because nobody knows if you're a dog in cyberspace. Nobody knows if you're Black or Jewish or a 14-year-old gay Japanese kid or an obese 60-year-old European man. And it seemed to us that in these environments like the Palace or Usenet, that we could finally live the race blind world we were going for. And Rodney King, after the first, what seemed like a digital event, Rodney King finally is the one who's saying, why can't we all just get along? And it seemed that the internet could bring could culminate in television's vision of a big blue marble. But of course, it turns out that the digital is actually, in some ways, the opposite. The digital, promotes individualism or intersectionalism. Everything is customized. Everything is personal. We went from the Apple's vision of e-world, which was Apple's version of America Online in the early 90s. They called it e-world. Everything was e this and e that and e-permits and we went from E to I, right? To iMac and iPhone, right? All of this sort of individual intersectional kind of identity, right? So our identities went from feeling like we're the nodes in the network to our identities being defined by whatever is connecting, whatever's connected to us, which is tricky, right? Then it's my group or my thing. And I feel like, in some ways what we're dealing with now culturally is the contrast between these two visions of mediated interconnectedness of all kinds of people. We're retrieving both our individuated identities, and we're still in this trying to make it all work out in one big Gaian thing. So there's that. Then the other main line, I guess I'm following along this, is the way that digital has amplified colonialism and the colonization. So where in the original industrial age, you colonized by getting a boat and going and finding some place with brown people and taking their stuff and enslaving them. In digital, you don't travel anymore. You colonize human time and human attention and human awareness and human data. So we all become, even if it's virtually, we all become, although physically too, we all become enslaved in a certain way. And I feel like that's what gives rise to sort of Bernieism and a new kind of a new kind of anti-capitalism, when we see that, oh, wait a minute, the white tech bros, they got all the way to the edge of California. They ran out of world to colonize. So now they're colonizing us. So of course, now as we white, college educated guys are getting colonized, we can go, oh, wait a minute, that's what they were doing to black people, right? This is only, you know what I mean? Now we kind of, we identify, because now we're on the other side of this machine that seems to be, colonizing everybody. But what I wonder then, I mean, the question that I'm still asking myself is then, what does revolution look like in this situation? Is revolution the commonality of our economic and technological exploitation? Or is revolution some alliance of the individual intersections that are kind of waking up, and the different cultures? Because I'm definitely experiencing this retrieval of medievalism, the retrieval of indigenousness of First Peoples, this retrieval of all the stuff that's been repressed, not just back to Francis Bacon, but back to the invention of linear thinking, the invention of text, really the first medium outside the body. With the invention of text, we got the invention of the future and the invention of the past. With the invention of text, we got the covenant, the Torah, this contract into the future and the story of our past. It's what set in motion the whole Judeo-Christian drive towards progress, which is a beautiful thing on one level, but it's this ends justifies the means linear journey towards always, bigger, better, more, new. And we've seen that doesn't work. So the fact that we're forced now to deal with the fact that, oh, linear time is over and everything is a circle, everything does come back, there is nothing new under the sun, I'm interested to understand, what does this sort of reclamation of human autonomy and agency, what does liberation, what does revolution look like after this, in a post-colonial, in a post-linear, and I wouldn't call it and a post-television, post-global world. if that makes any sense. It's sort of a question.
What will revolution look like? Right. I can see a few people on the chat have some good answers, but it won't be televised on TikTok. Right. So I think at this point, I just wanted to sum up as far as we got, because my own interest in Afrofuturism started quite a long time ago, because I'm a child of moon landing. It's one of my first memories, watching the moon landing as a tiny kid, and just remembering it, that it actually might matter. No idea why, but it really stuck with me. And then I found myself in Zambia in the early 80s, where my father worked. And I discovered the Zambian space program, which was running between 1960 to about 1969. And it was pretty damn crazy, ambitious like hell space program, where one of the guys who was the founder of Zambian Space Agency decided to train a whole pile of people in weightlessness and rolling down the hills in barrels, just to be ready for that space trip. Because, you know, when we were growing up, everybody thought that the space trip would be tomorrow, that, you know, we will definitely go to Mars on holidays. Like, why wouldn't we? You know, it was so tangible, and it was so, particularly in Eastern Europe, you know, we could do Sputnik, we could kick American ass, we could do anything. So that whole sphere of communist countries, which were really on the edge, like, yep, we're going to space. And Zambians really had a very intense program. So I was watching it from the perspective of, you know, a few years later, when obviously it didn't happen. However, what I discovered, I met somebody who was involved in that, and they were telling me that that's what initiated the Black Astronauts program in America. So it was quite early on when they tried to formulate, you know, not obviously marriage-based, because you have to be, but how can we bring more people to the space program? So the first African-American astronauts were up and running quite early on in the program. Quite a few of them died in proceedings, but you know, I always thought that ambition really delivers. You just have to think big, and something somehow moves on. It just might be 20 years later, so you just have to be fucking patient. But we are now at the verge of a revolution, as Douglas is saying, and things are definitely falling apart. The wheels are definitely coming off the car, and who is going to grab it? Who is going to run with it and, you know, create something new for everybody, inclusive futures, because the futures is not going to be what we were getting. So no neoliberal crap anymore. So it's a great opportunity for everybody.
You know, hey, I want to just jump in for 1 second again. Doug, that was a great riff. I really enjoyed hearing that. And David, I want to triangulate between the three streams I'm seeing here. Again, like a dialectical approach, which is a remix, which is the fun part about what Doug was talking about and what David was talking about, if you triangulate it, is that capitalism itself is about the idea of scarcity. But the human imagination is the world's most renewable resource. And the fun thing about the imagination is that the context of how capitalism sequesters and locks down things, of course, we're now, most people are in debt. The capitalist crisis that the pandemic has exposed has made us all realize we're all sharecroppers. But our virtual 40 acres and a mule have never arrived. And so the pun here is that how we are re-navigating these very, very fractured terrains of capitalism in a digital dialectic here. That's something I think is a powerful kind of moment of reflection, because revolutions occur when there's a massive crisis or disruption in the system. But we can sell revolutions. In fact, they have, you know, groups like, for example, Cambridge Analytica with what it did with Brexit, and there's thousands of data points that they were able to use to manipulate opinion and create sort of a digital sort of persona for each person that was easily able to be emotionally, psychologically, you name it, hacked. These are things that I think, again, and the crisis of African-American culture in this, and the rise of Black Lives Matter over the last couple of years has pointed out exactly what you both were saying, Doug, Eva, David. Derek, I'm super psyched to hear what you're going to be saying in a second, because I think Derek's got some great stuff on this. I remember Derek doing some riffs way back, but sorry to intervene, but I just wanted to kind of do a little jump in there because it was really of the moment.
It's this triangulation across all of these things, Paul, that you're commenting on, that I'm really interested in. And actually, the word that you use there that kind of allows me to create an axis to spin it around is this idea of persona. This is the thing that's leaping out at me within this idea of racist technology and Afrofuturism as retrieval, because I think this particularly goes back to Doug's point, going back to how we emerged and entered into the era of these new technologies coming out of television, coming out of the old media, which kind of framed how we worked and engaged with those technologies. And I think a really important thing to recognize, I'm going to come on to this idea of persona in a little while, but just to touch on the fact that where I'm going to with this is that a mistake we can often make is to separate the last 20 years or so of these new technologies from the ideas of the old media, the old ideas of how our consciousness is shaped, and how how many may have been surprised to find that we've arrived back in this way where there is a hegemony that is able to shape our consciousnesses in many ways. One of the things that came to me when Doug talked about the idea of television, if I just talk about the form of these technologies for a while before I go back to these ideas of identities and persona and data, which I'm going to connect in a little while, is it reminds me of when Digital Diaspora did an event called the Digital Slam. And Digital Diaspora existed to kind of to look at Afrofuturism, look at the works of Mark Derry and Samuel Delaney, and look at all of the questions surrounding race within this area. We held an event. We held an event called 40 Acres and a Microchip, both in the ICA in London and at the Kitchen in New York. And I think Paul was part of that event. And we conducted an interesting experiment in an old moo or mud at that time, where we were engaging in lots of dialogue and discourse. And there was an individual that people were trying to pinpoint, trying to understand this individual's persona within that discourse that was happening live in real time at a point in time. And there was a specific moment when Greg Tate jumped up and announced, shouted through his mic, "That guy's black." And the reaction in the ICA at that moment in time, which was totally appropriate, was to jump all over Greg and challenge him on the assumptions that he made around that person being black. And the assumptions were all rooted in an American experience of blackness that allowed him to kind of identify whether that person was black. And it took us on a discourse of what being black actually is. I think it's interesting, Paul, that you frame the distinction in terms of black people don't have the monopoly on suffering, and a distinction that is very much rooted in the American experience. For us here in the UK, this idea of the Civil War and Reconstruction and all of that may have parallels to the rest of us, but they're actually a very different experience. What is common is the rooting in capitalism, the idea that race is a construct out of which capitalism was birthed, and colonialism. And for us, there's a very strong post-colonial experience, the way that one particular generation of the diaspora here in the UK is very much rooted in the Windrush experience, and it very much framed Black identity in Britain. Today, West Africans outnumber Afro-Caribbeans very much, so it's a whole very different question. So it is a diasporic question, but I want to come on to this idea of these personas, this idea of what Greg thought could identify people as being black, because I think this idea of Afrofuturism as a retrieval, as a model that we can look at, is a very interesting one, because one of the things that has fascinated me about mainstream sci-fi recently is this current obsession with this idea, going back to the failed prequel to Battlestar Galactica, Caprica, and new pieces of television like that series Devs, is this idea that we've moved into an era of capitalism where data is the currency, but that data is ours and they're stealing our data, they're stealing our personas. But what connects this back to Doug's idea, or my interpretation of Doug's idea about how old technologies and old media frame the way we understand things, is we have to question whether or not these identities, these personas that are being manipulated in cases like Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and so on, are actually indeed us. What we have is a long history of our personas being constructed. And this comes back to Paul's point about we don't have the monopoly on oppression. Every individual entering into these worlds at the moment has his identity and persona shaped by all of those historical influences. They're manipulated in a way so that we become these personas, we become these resources that can be used and exploited in a particular way. Our identities are shaped and influenced, and then once they've been nurtured in the greenhouse, they can be collected, and then we can be exploited and sent out to do work in those particular ways. So this idea of retrieval, this idea of reclaiming is a hard job, a very hard job that involves looking beyond just the digital and looking beyond the 90s and so on and so forth, and understanding colonialism on a grander scale.
Right, that's a pretty strong direction. I think that's very interesting for us because we've been grappling with that idea of Sankofa, which is looking back to solve the future. And we are very much of time where future was supposed to take care of itself and be just better because we want it to be better. So I think it's a very good time to start thinking about why the future doesn't really want to be better. We have to fight for it, and we all have to fight on it. So I think at that point we haven't got the Hypen girls, but they sent me little stuff about them. So just to bring the Afrofuturist feminist perspective before we go to discussion, can I just say a couple of words about them? Because Hypen Lab, it's an outfit from, I think, Boston University or MIT, where they're deploying virtual reality and kind of digital thinking about products, not dissimilar to Paul was trying to do in his book, Imaginary Apps. So I think Paul invented this idea of writing non-commercial apps and ask a bunch of people what apps would they like to see that are not just extracting money. And my favorite app from this book was obviously teleporting. I want an app for teleporting. But the other one was an app for GPS, where to find good luck. And that was just really nice way of looking how much better future would have been if we didn't end up as basically being data sources for the new digital colonialism. But the Hypen girls developed few interesting products reflecting quite oppressed experience of being women of color in digitality. So I really like that because they obviously acknowledging the fact that women spend a heck of a lot of time in hair salon. So even I did a little bit of that today. And they acknowledging that in virtuality. So they have this concept that you come to virtual, to a physical armchair and you sit down and that becomes your conduit to a virtual hair salon where things start happening to you because we're experiencing brain modulation as part of our ritual of doing our hair. And that brain modulation can test and improve the perception of identities and race and the other. So I really love that because, we're missing that with virtuality. It's always kind of very cold. And I think what Weil was expecting yesterday is just pixels, while they brought to me that kind of, it is connected. We just have to connect it better, physical with real. But a couple of product that they created. One was a scarf, which reflects facial recognition. And it came from very simple idea. You have this fabrics that have lots of eyes on them. And they realized using Snap that Snapchat filters were very confused by this loads of eyes on the scarf. So they built it into like basically a scarf that deflects from facial recognition because obviously people of color, the perception is biased because the training of algorithm. is biased. So it's more of a problem. So I love that product. And they also created another product, which is a set of earrings that record and could witness if anything terrible is happening to you. So in some way, they're very sad products because they're reflecting women reality, women futures of constantly being oppressed and constantly fearing for their life and constantly fearing everything around them. That is just the way things are. But also, I love the fact that they can explore virtual reality to reflect what would VR and digital futures be like if it was hosted by women. When your visit to VR starts from meeting women who own that space and who inhabit that space. So I won't go any further, but you have to check that piece. So Ben, have you got the little snap from the little clip from Hypen Girls, Hypen Lab? If we have it, then we can play just half a minute. No.
I just shared it in the chat, Ava, not wanting to play it whilst you were talking.
Okay.
Now.
Okay. So hopefully we'll do something with them separately.
I have a quick request. I just want to riff for just a second, because oh, okay, you go for it. I just saw the slide. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I haven't got the sound, but you basically come into, you sit in the chair, you put your VR headset on, and that takes you to sitting in a chair in the virtual.
I've seen this.
And then it takes you on a visit where through the beauty rituals, you're experiencing brain modulation and changes in your perception of others. It's very beautiful and in a very VR style, very cathedral-like, with amazing. You paddle through the black lava to the island where you meet these amazing women who are the goddesses and hostesses, and they're all scientists. They're all women of STEM. It's not a long piece, it's not a game, it's very experiential, but as you approach the island, you can see the temple and you can see the three silhouettes who then come and greet you, and they are the women engineers who will lead you to your new brain modulation experiences. So those are avatars of the girls who actually make the space. It's fabulous, so you've got to see it. Okay, right, so I think at this point we covered the basics. I just wanted to run one quick poll to just see if everybody is still with us. Right, so how do you feel about sci-fi movies and writing? Are they necessary for humanity to progress? Somewhat necessary, or I could take it or leave it. So let us know.
Can I jump in on that too, Doug and Derek? What you were just saying, I wanted to show you guys really quick. This is when nature optimizes physical materials. It's called, sort of fractals. And there's one of my favorite books recently was, it's not recent, it's old, was by Ron Eglash. It's called African Fractals. And he looked at how indigenous mathematics in West Africa had influenced everything from design to haircuts to, use in fashion. And this is actually an architectural schematic of several villages. And you can actually see an architectural schematic of when you see the village from above. And so there's a human engagement with nature that I feel like what's powerful about films like The Matrix, for example, where they had to, they're fighting the simulation. The simulation, of course, if you look at Morpheus, for example, there's these whole series of films throughout the 20th century that fear of the other as a robot, or fear of, whether you're looking at Metropolis, where the robot begins to lead them forward, or for example, what's going on with The Matrix, where the oracle's a mixed race African-American woman. And of course now stuff like, I'm sure, I don't know if you guys got a chance to see The Watchmen, which was pretty brilliant. Actually, I'm on the fence about Lovecraft Country, and personally, I'm just not into horror that much. But there's this kind of a movement right now where there's a kind of sense of biological surrealism. I'll give you another example, which is that the Nigerian actor who played the alien, you know, and in the film Alien by Ridley Scott, was kind of like a Nigerian statue that would actually then possess you, and to take over your body and then have all sorts of stuff popping out of your body and stuff. And I'll just show you this photograph just for 1 second here. His name was Bolaji Badejo. He was a Nigerian actor who was doing some pretty, you know, he was a tall gentleman, and I'll just show you this really quickly so you can see. And basically the creature, Ridley Scott, when they were looking for actors, they ended up finding a tall African gentleman who was at a bar in London. And they said, hey man, we're making this crazy film called Alien. Can you play the character? And a lot of people didn't know, but the actual alien with this weird elongated skull looks like a very specific style of West African sculpture. So there's been this kind of subtext to a science fiction film for a long time, fear of the rise of robots. The robots are of course, the forced labor of people. And these kind of things are part of the basic foundation of, even my favorite recent film is Christopher Nolan's film Tenet, which if you haven't seen it, it's brilliant. And this African-American actor comes from the future, and they're playing a series of nonlinear war games to determine the future. Christopher Nolan, his film Memento is also one of my favorites, where the guy can't remember anything and has to keep writing the script of his memories on his skin. If you haven't seen Memento, Christopher Nolan just generally has this implicit nonlinear sense in most of his films. Interstellar, for example, and so on. Inception. And I found that The Matrix, what was fascinating was that Morpheus, who was played by Lawrence Fishburne, you know, was in this kind of subtle duel with the computer, but they needed the Oracle, who kept returning as a mixed race African-American woman. These kind of things I feel like are part of the foundations of our contemporary mythologies of simulation. But meanwhile, while we're sitting here, the interface that we're all talking to each other looks like the Brady Bunch from back in the day. I mean, I always chuckle about the way the Brady Bunch aesthetic is now part of, you know, our kind of opening sequence for this time, because I'll just show you, it's pretty funny. Like, this is like, at this point, years ago, and I just can't seem to get the sense that people still can't really like make better interfaces.
You're gonna play the title sequence of the Brady Bunch?
No, but just think about it. I mean, this is from an American TV show. You know, I couldn't make this stuff up. And so the interface of our time, I mean, Doug was talking about TV and other things. We've tried to grapple like the metaphors from previous archaeologies of media into this data-driven algorithmic contemporary narrative, and it doesn't, the fit isn't working, but it's still eerie to see how we'll use these older forms to try and graft onto a newer sense of ideology. Anyway, I just dug there. I was thinking that might be a riff, just riffing with you guys.
Yeah, and one thing it makes me think of, which is maybe not related at all, and maybe you guys have had to talk about it all the time, but is the way what to me a white Western technological future got grafted onto Black Panther. You know, I was ready to go to this movie. Everyone was talking about, oh my God, it's a celebration of blackness and Black and Africa. And then it's like, oh, we go through this force field and it's like, oh, look, ancient Africans were cool because they made high-tech European style cities, as if that's the sort of universal judgment. It's like there was no fractal, you know, high-tech fractal village like what you're talking about in the architecture book. You know, it wasn't that. It wasn't African technology, you know, seeing what was valuable, what was so advanced. Instead, it was like the only way to make them seem advanced to modern American audiences was to have them do, you know, it looked like a Boeing factory or something had made that place.
It's really interesting as well, because you had this situation where the costume was very much, was drawing on I don't know where they were getting it from, but they were using what appeared to be kente cloth very much in the costume design, but failing to understand the mathematics that goes into kente design, which is drawn from the nature of fractals. And right. So all of those things are completely connected, but they were completely disconnected in a movie that I have to admit I quite enjoyed, but you know, yeah.
Well, I think this is one of the interesting things about something like Afrofuturism is that, it opens up a space to try to like reimagine something, right? But of course, the problem is that it often fails, right? So, I mean, we have to imagine that the failure of that can be as instructive as its success. And I think that Black Panther is a really useful example of that because, as you say, we can't imagine what a sort of like non-Western, non-white future looks like because we don't have any of the tools for that because it's been stolen, right? It's been kind of taken away under all these different sort of uses, right? So I just think that that's a sort of fascinating problem in this case.
I've got a couple of questions from the audience. Let me just see one I can read. So a question from Simon Sarginson. So to Douglas and others, in terms of revolution, do you have more hope for moves towards divergence and decentralization? Or do you fear convergence and everything integrating into the digital further? What do you think? Are we diverging or are we still centralizing? There's worse to come.
I mean, I think it's a paradox that we haven't quite wrapped our heads around or we haven't resolved. But I feel like the revolution will happen locally. That it's actually the revolution itself is a revolution against sort of global industrial values, this artificial nation state like huge, towards these things happening at scale. And I feel like the revolution will not happen at scale. It will happen locally, but then be modeled and replicated and networked. So I envision more of an anarcho-syndicalist revolution rather than a new, giant AFL-CIO or a globally administrated revolution.
David, do you want to come on that?
No, I mean, I think I basically agree with that. I mean, I think that for the most part, at least I really hope that it looks like that, right? I mean, I would rather it look something like an anarcho-syndicalist kind of situation than maybe something more monolithic. I mean, I think that, the danger I think in this is that, the digital has allowed for things to kind of silo in ways that we didn't see before. And so how do we sort of like break through some of that so that we don't have these kind of strange fractured worlds where somebody like, people mentioned QAnon before, but that's a good example. It's like, how do you deal with that in sort of the information glut that we're working with at this point, right? How do we sort of protect ourselves from that kind of weird misinformation and the way that digital technology allows us to kind of cut ourselves off from any kind of counter to that, right? But, I still think divergence more than convergence would be my hopeful answer.
I think there's something in what Paul was talking about in terms of DJ culture and collaging as well, that facilitates this kind of anarcho-syndicalist idea as a counter to the kind of silos that we've been retreating into, but it has to be on that basis. I mean, one of the things I was going to touch on when Doug was talking about, and we've come back to it a few times, looking at this idea of how we can't envisage anything outside of this US-centric notion, Black Panther film, but also in terms of form and modes of engagement, how, television and that idea to keep us in that frame just takes me back to an event that a project that we once worked on, which was called the Digital Slam, which was held again in New York and London, and it was about connecting artists to collaborate together in a real-time performance and looking at what kind of collaging they could do by connecting in that way. And it was done by Digital Diaspora because we were interested in conducting those activities across the diaspora. And a journalist made a comment, a TV journalist made a comment when talking about it later on, which said that there was nothing new in that. It had happened before with Live Aid. And what was interesting for me, less than offensive, but amusing for me, was that it was impossible to conceive of then in 1995 what we were trying to do outside of the lens of television. That it was completely different. It was about a multi-way, real-time collaboration, not just simply this technology that allows you to beam signals and beam media across the planet. It was actually about those connections in the moment of creating. And so, but again, and now when we look back, we look at how all of the work that went into kind of making that even possible for musicians to play together in real time, for all of those things to happen, has just simply enabled us to have more bandwidth, better video codecs, so we can so that we can receive and consume Netflix. And that's the challenge that we now face. Is this moment bringing us to the point where we can grab hold of these networks and use them in a way to find these connections, in very much in the way that Black Lives Matter allowed the George Floyd incident to then become an all-encompassing look at all of the issues affecting people in the diaspora across the world. So it was George Floyd, but then here in the UK, there were the colonial slave masters who became the primary target of the demonstrations here in the UK. And in other parts of the diaspora, other things happened, other things connected to that global phenomenon that were specific locally across the diaspora, but that were connected in what seemed like a global movement, a global syndicalized movement, if you like.
Well, I just want to add something really quickly to that, because I think it's such a good point, but it also, do we think it comes down to something like the problem of access and control over media production, right? I mean, this becomes an issue in and around digital technology because, of course, with Web 2.0 and beyond, right, we don't have access to that in nearly the same way that we used to. And I just wonder, especially, you know, whether we want to think about that. I know, Douglas, you've talked a lot about this. I think, Derek, your work is involved with this, or maybe, Paul, you could talk about this in terms of sort of remix culture. But there's a lot of interesting ways that I think, you know, how do we sort of re-seize the sort of means of production in some ways?
Just before we give everybody final comment, can I just bring our friend and writer, Stephen Oram, who has done quite a lot in the field of sci-fi, and maybe what would be your view on the opportunities of Afrofuturism from the sci-fi perspective? Do you want to comment on our chat?
Yeah, I mean, what a chat. Comment for hours probably, but I was partly because I'm at the moment just working my way through thinking about another novel, and the whole sort of post-capitalist extractive capitalism, commonality, all sorts of things. I was really heartened to hear that I've sort of settled in the same place as people on the panel were saying, like sort of anarcho-syndicalism being the way forward. I guess, and this is probably an unfair question, Doug sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, which is, I'm sort of wondering, you know, when you're writing something, you're going from A to B, and the conflict is going from A to B rather than just writing in a utopia. So sort of, I'm just wondering what people might think those first little steps are that start that journey away from where we are and on the way we'd like to go. But more importantly, I think is, and this is easy with hindsight, obviously, like what is it that could trip us up in the way that, you know, Doug was talking about? We could only see the world from a TV sort of perspective rather than a digital perspective. I just wonder if there's any thoughts around how that journey might start. Indeed, it might have already started. But also what's the sort of messy human bit in there that could sort of trip us up along the way?
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, I've got some answer for that, actually. You know, one, I feel like what always starts me off on the path is nausea. You know, what got me interested in digital technology was the fact that I was nauseous with theater, and that my production of Three Penny Opera, the cheapest seat, was $40. And what am I doing, right? Where's my Brecht? And now I feel like the fact that people are on Zoom and whatever they're doing and Snapchat and all this 24/7, the experience I'm having reminds me of when my father caught me with a pack of cigarettes in my jacket pocket when I was in high school, and he didn't yell at me. Instead he said, "We're going to go on the back porch after dinner." And I went there, and he made me smoke the whole pack of cigarettes until I was throwing up and green and sick for what seemed like days, and never wanted to smoke again. And I feel like that's where we're at, that we're so we're on Zoom and these devices 24/7, that the minute we're allowed to be, the minute we're free, we're not going to want to use any of this except for work, except when we have to. And we're going to, reclaim our real world space, our real relationships. Who are my neighbors? Where do I live? What's the air I'm breathing? That there could be, I don't know, that's my hopeful take on what the first step would be. It's just utter disgust with where we've gotten.
That sounds quite likely to be.
And Doug,
I think it was
to
Paul
kind
who
of,
said something like,
and Doug,
reclaiming what it means to be human. And I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed, quite, the first sort of lockdown, so to speak, people were a bit sort of, oh, this is quite interesting. And then the thought of another one, everyone's just going, oh, come on, no. Can't do this.
David, do you want to answer that comment? Where do we start?
I think that, I struggle with sort of pessimism around some of these things because I think it's the human element that's going to mess this up for all of us. I think that, in some sense, I think until we start to take into account, right, how do we think about radical social change that involves something like pleasure and fantasy, it's going to be really hard to actually make anything happen because, of course, that's where capitalism really lives, right? It lives through advertisement. It lives on sort of adapting itself to our unconscious. And I think that, it's done such a good job of that, right? Of kind of, colonizing the unconscious, that it's going to be really hard to break out of that because, again, we can't imagine what the spaces of real alterity look like, right? Which I think is one of the reasons why it's useful to go to, indigenous cultures. It's interesting to look at Afrofuturism. It's interesting to try to look to really radically different spaces to try to look at something that would be different from that. But, it's going to be an uphill battle. I'll try to say something more uplifting at the end of this, just as a, mood. But I think that, the last few years of living in the US have not left me feeling particularly optimistic.
No, and what I would add to that is part of the problem, I think, one of our tragic flaws in the West is we, especially the sort of white tech, well-meaning white tech bros, want to believe that their idea is somehow new and original. My whole problem, with Social Dilemma is that these guys act as if, oh, I woke up one night and I realized maybe we're living in a surveillance culture. Maybe we're manipulating people. So they're going to try to, and it's like by ignoring the legacy from which they come, they guarantee they're a match being struck, and they guarantee the minimal longevity, rather than looking at, oh my gosh, I'm part of a tradition that dates back to Richard, Richard, our own Richard Barbrook. Who was talking about the California ideology. And then you go, oh, well, Richard, oh, yeah, but that goes back to Marx and Hegel. And that might go back to Abraham or Moses or somebody. That if we see ourselves as part of a lineage rather than the discontinuity, we're going to be so much better off.
Okay, so on that note, we're nearly at the end, but I just quickly wanted to ask Paul and maybe David, what do you think about the works of the younger generation of female artists like Janelle Monáe and similar? So her concept of arc androids and that whole set of personas that she's exploring to revisit Afrofuturism. But Douglas, I know you've got to run, so last.
My something I wanted to share just as a privileged white American dude is I feel like there's there's a troublingly limited perspective on Afrofuturism as this cultural thing, this like arts and culture, and somehow if it's in arts and culture, then it's kind of safe. So anyway, just the thinking of Afrofuturism purely in cultural and artistic terms rather than in hardcore socio-economic terms. I've been doing a lot of research. I speak a lot about cooperative economics and circular economics and favor banks and local currencies and platform cooperatives. And I did this talk with a bunch of these World Economic Forum people there, these Europeans, who then said, oh, that's fine for you sort of, white, wealthy, cultural creatives, but how could Black inner city people understand these mechanisms? And I'm like, dude, the Black inner city Americans invented these fucking mechanisms, So there's a terrific, relatively new book by Jessica Gordon Nembhard called Collective Courage, which really looks at least in America since about 1600, how Blacks invented economic cooperative enterprises and built up their cities, achieved or their sections of cities, and achieved prosperity, and then got, of course, raped and pillaged because the white people living nearby who had economic access didn't understand how a community that didn't have access to the larger economy could actually be more prosperous than their own. And it's because they were using different mechanisms optimized for the velocity of money. So for me, the vanguard will be retrieving an Afrofuturist vision that includes these genuine, these hardcore practical economic and social mechanisms that we're just beginning to retrieve. But there's hundreds, if not if we go back to Africa, all the way to food sharing, if not thousands or tens of thousands of years of experience with these mechanisms that we in the West are just reinventing now.
Well, yeah, just maybe to piggyback off of what Douglas, you were just saying, is that I think that, what's important about something like Afrofuturism is to imagine it not simply as a kind of cultural form, but as something which opens up a space, right? It opens up a space for a new perspective. It opens up a space for sort of a new place to start to look at things. Because I think that this is maybe one of the problems. And I'm not sure that this is really about sort of imagining the imagination as a resource so much as thinking about how we necessarily don't see, right, alternate solutions to what we're faced with. Right. And I think there's a real problem of vision here. We can't imagine what the world looks like that's different. And I think that, the phrase that, I keep coming back to is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, which seems like it's actively playing out right now. Right. And I think that that would be something which is really important. Right. And I think that, at its best, right, Afrofuturism allows us to maybe open up a new sort of horizon. It opens up a space for thinking about something that looks really different. At its worst, of course, it simply is just the commodified version of that. But
great, that's very well put. Derek, what would be your closing remark?
Yeah, I think it's a closing remark that, like many of my remarks, piggybacks many of the others. I think, Doug was talking about is absolutely it. Let's kind of take it out of this idea of, and actually art itself can be so much more, but maybe as a transitional step is what Doug is proposing, is to extract these ideas from there so we can look at them as what they are. I mean, we talked about Black Panther earlier on, and the thing for me that made, in addition to all the stuff that we talked about in terms of that kind of Western capitalist lens, the thing that prevented it from being an Afrofuturist piece for me is that Killmonger wasn't the hero. The idea that you can create a kind of alternative socioeconomic model based on your own networks of technology and everything else, and then having achieved that, you go to the United Nations and say, we want to join your fucked up model, is not the outcome. The outcome is that we network that in that way. We create those syndicates that and across the diaspora and anyone else who wants to join in order to challenge the prevailing hegemony. And that's and that's kind of ultimately where we've kind of arrived, really, in some of the in the interconnections and some of the things we've been talking about here today.
Great. I think that's a really good segue to Richard Barbrook, who wrote the original piece on California ideology, and obviously worked with us on leading on the digital rights. So what would be your summary of what we need to take from the alternative perspective and alternative histories to the build?
Well, I think the funny thing was that when we wrote the Californian ideology, what freaked Louis Rossetto out the most was the bit that we thought was the most uncontroversial, where we mocked Jeffersonian democracy and said that freedom for white folks is slavery for black people. And if you're a European, I guess, and you look at American history, it's so obvious that this is, you know, the way the state is constructed, who were the founding fathers, why it was set up, and how, you know, Doug was talking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was, yes, you're right, you know, advances in science and philosophy and liberalism rather than democracy, but it was also the, you know, it was you know, it was, they said the free trade in Africans was the basis of it, factory labor, you know, the exploitation of my Irish relatives. So I think, you know, it's that dialectic. I think, you know, you have to understand modernity is both building of utopia and dystopia at the same time. And as I said, I thought that was very strange that they picked up on that as the thing that they were most freaked out about. Because, as I said, I remember as a child, I was about 7 or 8, and we went to Monticello, and I was absolutely fascinated by things like the dumb waiter in it. This thing where they could send food up from the kitchen and all the rest of it. And we were shown the servants' quarters, and it was only many years later I realised what all this meant. It was a way of actually him as the Enlightenment revolutionary, separating himself from the reality of his economics. How he was able to be a professional revolutionary is because he owned 200 people. And that was actually, it's the fact that they reacted to it, obviously shows what a great metaphor it was, that Jeffersonian democracy is actually a very good metaphor for the weakness of that 1990s dream of the digital citizen and all the rest of it. Because
do we think digital democracy can develop better definition of the future?
On this, that I think that, you know, what we could use is democracy, whether that's in the form of digital or not, great. But I think that, you know, a little bit more democracy would be the way to go. I think that, you know, digital tools are all fine and good, and I don't think that we need it, but I don't know that we need the prefix, right? I mean, I don't know that we need digital democracy so much as we just need democracy.
Derek?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The question is not whether digital democracy can save us, it's how we're going to achieve democracy, and genuine democracy, by the way. Let's be really absolutely clear, because we understand what the current hegemony defines as democracy, where we go to the polls every 4 years and vote for a different individual to represent the same system. Ultimately, it's about democracy. That question, I have to say, if you're saying it, it was a question of the 90s that we have looking at. It's just going back to that thing of saying, oh, here's this technology, it's going to save us. Why didn't it save us? Because we still had capitalism. So it's, you know, it's a, you know, the only place it has in that argument of democracy and social and economic justice is whether or not we're able to grasp parts of its tentacles and adapt them to serve the purpose of revolution.
But thank you so much for amazing discussion. Thank you, David, Derek, Paul, and Douglas and Stephen and Richard for the additions. We will stay on the chat for a little while longer, but we'll finish the official version now. So thank you very much for your contribution. We will follow up with the recording and blog, but it's been an honor and a pleasure to host it. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.